Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Kurt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 90 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm back here today with Jerry, continuing our Summer Big Idea series, where today we're going to look at the environment and happiness. If you're just joining us for the first time or the first time in a while, we've been using Johnathan Haidt's book, The Happiness Hypothesis, where he looks at current research in line with some of the bigger ideas in philosophy and religion. So even if you're not reading the book along with us, we won't lose you. So we'll let you catch up on the research and his thinking and give you our own and put the trauma-informed lens on it as well. So as always, we start out with our bright, shiny objects of the week. I'm fascinated by quite a few things going on in the news this week, but I'm going to go happy this time and just give a shout out to our women's U.S. women's soccer team, because not only did they pretty much dominate the World Cup, they really, I think, are lending a powerful voice to women in sports. And it was fun to kind of learn about how not only have they opened that up in the United States and really empowered women, but also that a lot of European teams, because they saw the popularity of the U.S. team, they're getting better as well. So it's nice to see that, that our ladies are having a huge influence, not just in our own country, to show the popularity of women's sports, but also around the world. So big shout out to them. I know my wife and I were cheering them on to victory last Sunday, and just happy to see we can play soccer in the United States. So, and our men came in second, which I didn't watch any of that, so I can't talk about it. But Jerry, what are you thinking about this week?
I also was pretty excited about women's soccer team. In terms of them and their equal pay, they got a ways to go. I mean, there was a long time that men athletes didn't get paid bupkis, and now they're getting paid. And in some ways, they have to go through the same process that men had to go through. It wasn't long ago that hockey players weren't making very much, and they're kind of looking at it. Now you see where things are at. So both understanding you got to keep the pressure on, and also understand it's a process. It's not.
Yeah. I think they took a big step in the right direction with another win.
Kind of looking at that piece. But, I also wanted to kind of recognize, holidays and what they mean. And we were up at Red Feather Lake up north here in Colorado, and small town. And when you get into small towns and those kind of relational kind of connectedness, around holidays, people seem to come out and be really nice. And so I think some of the rituals we have are really important to kind of maintain. Not necessarily, I'm not necessarily a big fireworks person, but I do think that they serve a purpose for us in terms of a shared reason to celebrate and come together. So, as we have these holidays, make sure you kind of stop and recognize it.
Absolutely.
Kind of looking at that. But I do think they ought to change it to Interdependence Day. This concept of moving towards independence really is a misnomer, as we'll kind of begin to look at in these. Happiness really depends on your connectedness.
Yes.
Not on our independence.
Yep.
So that's something we should kind of look at and relabel celebrate Interdependence Day.
Yeah. Well, and that's a great place to start us on the journey of this chapter. This one I was listening to on an airplane ride to Oakland, California, where I did some trainings this week, and boy, it was hard to say how did we want to structure this conversation, because he throws a lot at us on this chapter, and I think one of the first pieces, and I would actually disagree with him to a great extent on his conclusion, is the nature versus nurture thing. And he talks about us having a happiness preset, where then events influence that. And we've talked about in previous podcasts, especially about epigenetics, that the science is really showing that there's a mix between the environment and our DNA in a very real kind of I would say a relational way, that our bodies, our DNA responds to environmental demands. And I don't know if I agree with him, Jerry, on this happiness preset, but I was interested to get your opinion on it, where he says that happiness, at least the span of happiness we have, is sort of set with our DNA. And I kind of wonder what your reaction was to that.
Well, it's consistent with his beliefs throughout the book. So, he tries to find arguments to support his position. But really what we know is that this interaction between the environment and our biology, we know the research, although he doesn't look at it, maybe as he goes on, the research on attachment really is so significant in terms of, the ability or the experience of being seen and loved kind of allows us to be, in some ways, to love ourselves and to be in the world in a different way, as we kind of look at it from a trauma-informed lens. So, I think that this is a little bit of some people trying to hold on to an old way of seeing things and kind of finding some support. But I think your point about this interactional process really doesn't support his perceptions. He's also, his understanding of Buddhism is pretty challenging for me. So
I'm going to get to that, because that was one of the reasons I wanted.
What I'm just saying is, I think he continues to see things through his lens, which I think we all do. Yeah. Right? So I think he's a very good attorney and he makes good arguments. But I think that there are some arguments to be made in opposition to that. Yeah.
Well, and one of the things that I really think he, again, I think I agree with you. I don't think his genetic understanding really takes into account epigenetics. That's sort of part of our DNA that can be expressed in a lot of different ways. And also, he didn't really talk about the impact of adverse childhood experiences on overall mental health, where we know that there's, disruptions to cortisol systems, dopamine systems, serotonin. I mean, there's all this stuff that happens that is, not necessarily preset in our chromosomal DNA, the way that he kind of neatly tries to sum it up. So,
right. And he didn't really address experience adaptive development or use-dependent development.
Yeah.
Is that those systems that are activated with the most frequency become stronger in those. So an individual who lives in a world that's safe, supportive, and nurturing is going to have a much easier time experiencing happiness as opposed to somebody who lives in an unsafe, under-resourced, kind of threatening environment.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next piece he talks about, which is one of my favorite research studies of all times, is this nursing home study, where what they do is they study control and the impact of control. And I love this study. I think it was originally done. It's been done in a couple different variations, but it was done kind of on the first floor and the second floor of this nursing home. So there was no differentiation on who was on first floor, second floor. It's just kind of where they had a room open when you moved in the nursing home. And really all they did was to give people control of whether or not they had a plant and whether or not they wanted to water it or staff would water it, and when their movie night was. I mean, so these are very small things. I saw one that there was another study where they could control when they ate. So these are very small choices. But in a nursing home where you might not have a lot of perceived choice because everything's kind of on a schedule, they really, I think what these studies do is they show the choice that people have, or provide a small, what I think most people would say be a pretty meaningless small choice in how their day goes, or something like movie nights. The really cool thing about this is that in these studies that I've seen, whether it's this one or other ones, you get these outcomes where people are happier, healthier, and I've actually seen some of these studies be canceled because the people that weren't given choice were dying off at a much higher rate. So it became unethical. And this study says there was a 15% mortality rate with people that had the choice of movie night and plant watering versus 30% of people that didn't have a choice. So actually the mortality rate, and I've seen this in other similar studies too, is almost double in size. So, I find this really powerful and has really informed my thinking on service delivery, because I think, I know a lot of times there's not the flexibility within programming or even in our communication to help put forth the choices that people do have, to experience some autonomy and to have some empowerment. I know empowerment gets thrown around a lot, but I've always loved this study and these similar studies. And I just kind of wonder, when you look at these choice studies, Jerry, some of your thoughts, how even little things can have a big influence.
So my first thought is that as a species, we don't like to feel helpless and out of control.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that giving somebody a sense of control, in some ways, we know is a regulatory strategy.
Yeah.
Right? To kind of manage some of that. We also know there's all the studies on being at different levels of organizations and how feeling like when you're in control, how stress impacts you.
Mm-hmm.
So that the lower you are in the organization, the more chance that those experiences will lead to health problems, and looking at that. So there's lots of research that control. In terms of trauma, really the event is trauma. It's a potentially trauma event.
Mm-hmm.
What usually leads to trauma is a sense of helplessness and powerlessness.
Yeah.
Right? And so giving people a sense of control is very important. And sometimes that control really isn't just in the language we use.
Yeah.
Right? And so, there's some kind of research on trauma-informed yoga. So the language in yoga, sometimes yoga is a very demanding, commanding, get into this pose and we're going to get it. And really what we learn is that in trauma-sensitive yoga, there's an invitation to try this pose.
Yeah.
Right? And so really even changing our language about how we're inviting people to do things, or how we're suggesting people and getting their thoughts about what they would do, how they feel, giving somebody the ability to create signals to you when they feel like something's too much or right, is giving them a sense of control of the process, is a very important part of trauma-sensitive treatments.
Yeah.
So that these studies really do talk about it from kind of the aging perspective of in our society, how the elderly lose so much control and lose function, that to have some level of control. I heard a woman talk about how she was put up on the bookshelf. That they put her in this place, and her motto was, I'm like a book I've got put back on the bookshelf, and now I just sit here waiting. So I think it's a very important piece. The last thing I want to kind of talk about is, how do you look at your service or program and really examine where it is we can give people control back?
Right.
And that's a really, and what's the difference between creating consistency and structure and a loss of control?
Yeah.
Right? Is we know that consistency and structure and predictability make people feel safe. Yet a loss of control really increases the impact of stress.
Yeah.
So how are you balancing those issues out in your delivery of your program?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one of the things MI gave me as a skill is to helping people see that they do have a choice. I think that's one of the things that I never really thought of. And some of that choice might be to continue to do behaviors that we would rather them not continue, right? Yeah, there's always a choice to stay the same. And, I really like in MI, they talk about this menu of options, which I've gotten a lot of mileage out over the years of offering somebody three choices, because he also speaks in this chapter is we can get overwhelmed by too many choices. That, you go to the grocery store, and just because you have a million choices of cereal, that doesn't have the same health benefits as the small choices in these studies. Because sometimes in our modern society, it's an overwhelming amount of choice, which is nice that we have 1,000 types of cereal to choose from, but it's not necessarily all that beneficial to us, and we can get overwhelmed. And I think our folks definitely, if we say, hey, there's 18 different treatment centers you could go to, that can have that same effect. So I always like that, giving 3 or 4 choices to help them see where they do have power in their situation. It's just been a huge skill that before MI, I wasn't paying that much attention to. And you can give them permission to continue to do what they're doing. I think sometimes we get into, we've got to get them to change. But I think just sometimes saying, hey, you can keep using, you can stay the way you're going. That is an option that you have. Now, we might want to talk about the consequences of that action, but the reality is they don't have to do what we want them to do. And so I that's always been a really good insight for me that I've carried along ever since I read that strategy a few years back. So the other cool thing, and one that I've been dying to talk to you about, because I knew this was coming up in the book, is the concept of non-attachment. This is, as a fan of Buddhism and a fan of Taoism as well, I've learned a lot from both of those traditions. I like the philosophical Taoism maybe more than the religious Taoism, but really have learned a lot from those two approaches. But both of them talk in Taoism is kind of more non-action, but I think they talk about the non-attachment too, is where we try, and I think that, and if he doesn't understand Buddhist philosophy all that well, in our opinion, I will admit I probably don't either. So you can teach me a little here, Jerry, but I've always been striving for this non-attachment to things. And how I understand that is, if you don't put so much investment, especially into worldly possessions, but even relationships, that you minimize your suffering. You don't become as attached to things. So when those things might leave your life, you don't have that negative experience of that loss in such an extreme way. And, before we get into some of the research that he put forth, I just like to I've been dying to ask you, as I know somebody who studied Buddhism as well, is what's your thoughts about the non-attachment concept and how you've integrated that into your own life?
issue is, how can I accept what is?
Mm-hmm.
Right? The reality is we can't change what is that it is what it is. And then once we accept it, then we have some choice, right? If we're busy resisting what is, we're not really finding strategies on how to manage that piece.
Mm-hmm.
So that when you think about it isn't about, oh, I just accept anything that comes and it's okay for you to do anything. It's really, you can really be a jerk to me and I accept that about you.
Yeah.
Really, the issue is I accept you being a jerk right now and I have some decisions to make on how I want to respond to that. But instead of being upset that you're acting this way and I wish you wouldn't act this, it's like, you are acting this way and this is what's happening between us.
Right.
And how do I, and so that for me, that model has been a really good way for me to approach treatment.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It is that if I can accept you for what's going on in you without trying to change that, without trying to make you something, my acceptance of you doesn't necessarily mean it's okay for you to be abusive to me or kind of but I accept where you're at right now and I really truly want to understand where you're at and come as opposed to trying to change that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think his model is he thinks all it is Buddhist is all you do is you go inside and you sit and you change your inside and it changes the outside.
Yeah.
And I think that you do change the way you approach the outside, right? Not that you change the outside, but and outside things mean it. So I'm sure the Dalai Lama, if given a chance, wouldn't say, "Oh, it's great. I'm really happy that the Chinese showed up here and destroyed everything," right? But the fact is, they did. And now, how do I accept that and cope with it and not allow that to, in some ways, determine how I am in the world?
Yeah.
And I think that for trauma victims, that's a really big concept.
Mm-hmm.
Is yes, you may have been abused or neglected, but how do I come to some place where I can accept it without condoning it, and not have that continue to influence how I am in the world at the moment?
Mm-hmm.
Right? That you go back to this choice issue to kind of looking at that piece. So, his discussion of Buddhism really is this kind of, I'm going to put Buddhism, that the Buddha's sitting under the tree and really nothing in the world matters anymore.
Yeah.
I don't think that was really, but he really had to accept that people get old.
Yeah.
The disease in the world, not, oh, I want to sit here and not have to deal with any. It's about, I've got to understand that.
Well, I always thought that one of the concepts I learned somewhere early on in my study of meditation and Buddhism, and I mean, this was really early on, maybe even like in high school, that I've really always hung on to is the return to the marketplace. Whereas you can go into a cave or go into a retreat in the mountains where you don't have necessarily the connection to the world or other people or other things. But the real test of your personal progress is how are you when you go back into society? And I always I held on to that because I think it is sometimes easy to, go up into a cave and as long as somebody's bringing you food, you don't have to be worried about much. But that's not really the whole point of the journey. The whole point of the journey is to be a member of a community, but to hold on to that peace and insight and wisdom that you gain through your practice. And I always love that. I think we miss that second side too often of that returning to the marketplace. And that's always, I think, my own personal development. I was like, okay, how do I bring this into the world to do some good with it?
So I had this first time I took Tai Chi. teacher was a Korean instructor, and we used to have to do Tai Chi for approximately, we'd start with a kind of warm up, do some Tai Chi, and then we do a meditation. But at the end of the class, we had to wipe down the mats in the dojo, right? And so class would stop, and then we'd kind of wipe down this mats. And I remember her, and I'd want to kind of get out of there, so I'd be wiping down the mats, right? And I remember her saying, "How could you turn wiping down the mats into your Tai Chi?" Right? How could you how could you bring that same deliberate movement and kind of mindset to cleaning the mats? Or to being in a interaction with one of your clients, or to sit in a meeting with other coworkers trying to solve a problem. How do you bring that same deliberateness and groundedness, the capacity to truly be open and curious and listen, and at the same time being aware in a non-judgmentalness of what's coming up in you? That's it. So this concept of cleaning the mats have always, I'd say is I'm cleaning the mats, right? I left the dojo and now I'm cleaning the mats, and how do I bring this with me? So that's the metaphor that's been really helpful for me in my career. As I'm getting frustrated with, oh my God, they're cutting services, or they're cutting funding, and I'm sitting there, I say, well, how can not? I don't have to kind of be happy about it, but how do I see this as cleaning mats?
Yeah. And that's why that's where I got stuck early in Taoism too. And I think some of this is a translation problem with the non-doing sort of thing. And it's, I think what I learned from it, and non-attachment comes in really big, because I always want to get the outcomes, right? And we talk so much about outcomes, but I also really realized trauma neurobiology really helped me with this too, is there's so much going into those outcomes, is that I can be a small part, but even if I do a perfect job, which I always fall short of being perfect, there's so much going on to determine whether the person I'm trying to help gets to where I want them to be and where they want to go. And it's just given me patience with that journey. And I still am very invested in getting folks housing or helping them kick an addiction or whatever I'm trying to do, trauma treatment, whatever that might be. But at the same time, it's like, okay, there's a lot going on here with each individual. And to think that I couldn't control where they're going, I'm going to be the main variable in their journey. I hope I can be a significant one, but a lot, again, what they bring in, I know is going to determine those outcomes as well. So it's kind of helped me be a little bit more realistic and patient in my work, which is something, as you know, I'm not necessarily inherently great at.
That's why they call it a practice.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think if we think about our work in the helping professions, I've kind of played around with that term as a practice that we're trying to improve on. We're trying to bring our best to. I think there's a lot in that word. I wrote a couple blog posts about that later as I was trying to thinking about a martial art practice, and that, you just don't show up. You're working on something. And usually it's a small thing. It's not a huge jump. It's like, what am I working on today, and being humbled by the process. And, I think if we looked at our careers in that way a little bit more, maybe we'd be a little healthier in that regard. So,
that I always go back to this concept of we always do better when we're working on something, right? We're going someplace.
Yeah.
We envision having a goal and having rewards and kind of from achieving that. But we always do better when we can have immediate feedback, right, about how we're doing, right? So I think it's in our practice, it's important to say, I have an intention.
Mm-hmm.
The next question really to ask is, what would it look like if that intention manifested itself?
Mm.
How would I know whether I manifested this, right? So, for kids learning in school, a lot has to do with, we kind of figure out what we want them to learn, and then we give them a multiple choice test, right? And like that doesn't tell you whether they really learned it, right? And they understand it. So is to ask the question, if the class really understands it, what would that look like?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if I'm working with my client and I want them to begin to eventually get a job and eventually get housing, eventually, right? That's the end game. So, but what would it look like today if they took more initiative? And I want to teach them about taking initiative, right? So what would that look like for them today to take some initiative? It might be they come to the session with something to work on.
Yeah.
That's it. That's the groundwork towards getting the job.
Yeah.
Right? It's like you don't go in there and say, I want them to get a job, and then tomorrow I'm going to get you a job. What is the things I need to work with you around in order to help you be successful? Mm-hmm. And then the other question really is you getting a job your goal, or is it my goal?
Right. Exactly.
Right? What is your goal, and how can I help you achieve your goal?
Yeah. Well, and that's what, again, I find that if you definitely, and again, I encourage people to look at this as you begin the relationship with somebody, but also even at an individual when you meet with them on a regular basis, is what do you want to accomplish today? What do you want to accomplish with your work with me? And always to start there, because a lot of times what we get back is not sort of maybe what we think our role would be. But again, if we can prioritize what's important to other folks, they may be more open to me as saying, and I usually do this pretty softly, is, hey, for a lot of my folks, I like to talk at least about some housing options that we could explore. Do you mind if we put that on the agenda? But I always like, what do you want to accomplish in our work together? And then if I'm in a role where we're more, around, HIV health or housing or something like that, that, hey, I'm going to start out with what you want, but would you mind if we also explore this? And giving them the permission also to say, I'm not really interested in talking about that. Hey, if they're not interested in it, why am I going to waste my time forcing them to consider something that they're not in? And I've always found, hey, if I listen to you and what you care about, you're more likely maybe a week or two from now to listen to some things that I'd like to put on our agenda as well. And that partnership, it plays such a critical role.
So going back to this happiness, one is in that process, you're giving up some control, right? The other thing is if they set their intention and they're successful at getting their intention met, there's a lot bigger chance they're going to leave happier.
Yeah.
And more confident and more capable than they did coming in, which goes back to this concept of not only having control, but able to have in some ways the demands that are placed on us within our zone of proximal development, right? So how can I set goals that somewhat help me be successful? And if I'm successful and I'm happier, I'm probably going to be much more likely later on to get to the point where we're talking about jobs and we're talking, right? Yeah. And so I think that is really sometimes we want to get to the end goal and don't realize it's a process.
Right. Yeah. And again, that's where our rigidity, we got to be careful of, right? We got to be that flexibility. So. Right. So here he breaks down, my next question for you, Jerry, is he breaks down happiness into a very simple formula. So we already talked about how we sort of disagree with the biological set point, at least thinking that that's a genetic, predetermined, lifelong thing that doesn't change very often. I think we would agree that probably part of our conception of this formula would be everything that's kind of happened to you, how you've dealt with that. So both nature and nurture, I think we would put into that more than he does. His other two things, again, this is a 3-point way to look at happiness. And again, all models are flawed, but hey, if you can break it into a formula, I think it's at least worth talking about. The other two are conditions in your life and voluntary activities. So I'd like to start the conditions in your life thing. I find is interesting because, one of the things I think in our culture we often get too tied up in is how much money we make. And I always love the research that comes out about, hey, if you make a certain amount, and I think that's amount is, usually around anywhere between $80,000 and $100,000 per household. But, if you're in Denver, it might be a little higher because our cost of living is so crazy. So it's kind of hard anywhere to say it's this number. But things like whether or not you have people in your life that care about you. We know that people in happy marriages are happier sometimes than those aren't in happy marriages. So those conditions of your life and then those voluntary activities. So, God bless him for putting it, happiness, a very complex emotional state, into biological set points, conditions, and voluntary activities. So I just kind of wonder in your own life, Jerry, as somebody I know like myself who's looked at a lot of research, when you think about the conditions in life, voluntary activities, have you ever think about this in a strategic way as how could you maximize your own happiness using some of the research that he tries to collapse in a very simple formula?
Well, I think I'm a pretty genetically happy person. So that's, I start from that set point of being higher than most. But, going back to being how good looking we are and how, right, to looking at that. But I always like researchers, right? They take a variable and they kind of look at that, and then they make the assumption that variable's kind of what makes you happy, right? And the issue really is, I would bet that when you're happy, those conditions and voluntary activities look different than when you're unhappy.
Yeah.
When your conditions are changing, my physical health, for example, my ability to engage in voluntary activities changes, and then I have to still maintain my health, right? These are not separate, isolated variables. They all interact with each other.
Yeah.
But in research, we have to isolate something, right? And then you come up with this equation as if these things are not dependent on each other, and then dependent on the happy people around you, and dependent on, right? And so I think it's important to kind of say is, am I happy or am I not happy?
Yeah.
What are the conditions in my life that I don't have control over, and what is the things I do have control of? And for me, those are important questions to ask, but they're not independent of each other, and they're not weighted the same, right? And so, I've always said is, when I was struggling financially as a getting to graduate school and not making very much. I was making $3 an hour, kind of working in a hospital, and my conditions were bad, but I was involved with my wife. So life was really good.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying is we don't weigh these things equally. And then how you might weigh something is very different. For me, having children was a very important variable in my life. For you, it's not so much, right? To kind of looking at that piece. So I don't know how you just kind of put these things into an equation and then to make a list and say, oh, you got 10 of these things and 10 of these things you're happier.
Yeah.
I think the world's a lot more complex than that. And so these are the type of challenges I think researchers have bringing that information into my clinical practice.
Yeah.
my people don't necessarily come in with a list of these and a list of these and a list of those to kind of look at. Each person is very unique, and I have to have it. But I do think it's worthwhile to be thinking about what are some of the variables, or what are some of the protective factors that this person had in their lives.
Right. Absolutely.
What are some of the risk factors that this person had in their life?
Yeah.
What kinds of activities are they currently engaged in at the moment? What type of relationships are they currently engaged in the moment?
Mm-hmm.
And how is that either contributing or in some ways helping protect them during these particular times, to kind of look at that.
Right. And one of the things with this equation that also struck me as well is, what things like poverty and other things do to limit some of these things, not take them away totally, but boy, I just, again, coming off a week of working with homeless providers in Oakland, when you're in that survival state, I think about the kids we worked with in child welfare. When you talk about conditions of your life, when your home is at a point where it's too dangerous or dysfunctional for you to live in it, and we've got to take you out of that environment, sometimes maybe even against your will, and what that does to your happiness is almost something I think we didn't talk a whole lot about, because we were trying to help just people get out of major depressive episodes, or kind of see that tomorrow just is going to be a little bit better than today, because today's so devastating.
Uh-oh.
So the other thing that with voluntary activities, I do this in my own life. This form, not necessarily this formula, but I was like, okay, I
don't know if it's my computer and
hang out with people that bring happiness to me, those sort of things. So I really appreciate over time that it's a privilege to think about, how could I just systematically do gradual improvements to my condition, or gradually integrate voluntary activities that are going to make me a little happier. So, I think that's a little bit of the devastating piece of the research too, is how poverty, how trauma can limit your conditions to life and voluntary activities in a way that really can steal your happiness away.
Don't you think this is a little bit that science is trying to control something that's not necessarily always so easily controlled? The illusion of control.
Well, and did you ever think we measure happiness? Like that's just something to me as in mental health. It's like happiness is so ambiguous, and so I appreciate them trying. But yeah, I think it is that tight control over that. But
it sounds like John wasn't so happy in his life at one point.
Yeah. Right.
So measuring happiness and finding variables probably became a pretty important thing to him.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and again, I totally agree with you. Again, that there are those set points of, and I use this in my own life. I don't need to make any more money than I'm making. I know I'm lucky enough, I'm privileged enough to be in the sweet spot. Like if I made too much more money, I'd actually have more stress in my life. So I'm like, yeah, I want to stay right here, because granted, I could take a bigger vacation, or I could, but I don't want to necessarily sit in an airplane being 6'7" for that long anyway. So it's like, I think that spending money on experience versus physical things, I think the reminder that when you win the lottery, it doesn't really increase your happiness outside just a little bit of a bump. When you lose a limb due to an accident, doesn't really decrease your happiness long term, except for a decrease in a bump. And so, I totally agree with you that it's really hard to simplify this into these things. It does give you a little bit of strategies to think about your own life if you're privileged enough to sit back and say, okay, what class or what can I hang out more with my friends? even if I'm tired, because I know that's going to bring joy into my life. So I find it useful when you break it down, but limiting it at the same time as well.
I think it's an interesting perspective to try to break it down to a equation, measure it, and then say you got a number at the end. So you are a 6 on the happy scale. Man. It's
Yes.
like, all right.
Yeah.
I just, it's not the way I am in the world.
Yeah.
So it's hard for me. And I know there's a lot of people who like to organize things that way.
Yeah.
I don't really. So this was a hard chapter for me to kind of sit through and listen to him kind of try to put this into an equation and measure.
Yeah. Well, one of the things he does in the chapter with, sort of randomly, because this chapter goes in a lot of different directions, but I think a good place for us to kind of wrap up is gratitude and really the research, which I goes well beyond what he just presents here. But I did like that. I like how kind of he ended that chapter. And I just wonder in your own life, because I've seen some greater research on this as well, is how do you do anything strategically to kind of step back and say, appreciate the good in your life? Do you do anything strategically to make sure you pay attention to the wonderful things that life brings your way?
Well, 2 things on that. One is, being a student of neuroscience and biology, I understand that the way that I think about things changes the biochemistry in my body that in some ways actually has a physiological impact on how I am in the world. My energy levels, what I see, how I relate, to kind of look at that. So that's that piece, so that your mind can actually create changes. So focusing on gratitude or envisioning that things are already in my life that I would want as if they happened already. This power of intention kind of model, kind of looking at that. But the second part of that is I just have principles in my life that I don't wake up and have a practice where I'm grateful. I go through my whole day being grateful. I actually, when something goes wrong and somebody did something, I work to myself to always think the best and say, I wonder what happened on their end that made it, as opposed to what did they do and why did they do this? And is that if I found that if I could change how I approach my life, it makes me happier, right? And it also improves my relationships. And I'm much more effective in doing it. So I do think having a practice of gratitude, having a meta practice, which I do, is sitting down and, being grateful for being healthy and being grateful for feeling safe and being happy and kind of deliberately sending those messages to my body. But it's kind of like cleaning the mat. How do I bring that to work every day? And how do I bring that to, and I can't tell you I do it every day because I get stressed and I do it, but I'm practicing to really be open to seeing the best of people, to being able, and what I found is I've been very lucky. I haven't made $1 million, but I've always had enough money to get food and have a house and to kind of looking at those things. Yeah. And I attribute that to I'm happy and I attract good things in my life.
Yeah.
So I don't know how I fit into that equation, but I do think those practices create a biochemistry and an interpersonal that when you're with people, their biology resonates with your biology and you're more engaging.
Yeah. Well, and I think that to me is one of the key takeaways of all the research I've done into the self-care arena as well. As I think we have amazing, I mean, to be kind of the modern version of healers in our society, and we get to go to work and help people change their lives, or reach out to a kid in a classroom who might not feel connected to other people in the world. And we have these really amazing jobs. And I really, I always talk about in my trainings is I worry about the people that lose their why. Why are you going to work today? Because you're going to be able to do potentially amazing things. And again, we're part of supporting people through their own process. But how cool is it to be a part of people's process? And I think, my gratitude, I really find in many ways through my humility is that somehow in life I've created a whole life around I do what I'm passionate about, and somehow my mortgage gets paid because of that. And, I think that's always, every time I get on a plane, even if I'm really tired to go talk to folks, it's like, people actually will pay me to go speak what I would speak about if nobody was paying me. So I just think that when I keep myself out of the burnout stages and all that thing is just, hey, I'm just so fortunate and lucky to be doing this, doing podcasts with you, all these things that I've gotten these opportunities to do. And when I actually step back at it and look at it, I'm just in awe of, Jerry sat me down with the Adverse Childhood Experience study 15 years ago. And now I get to travel the country talking about my passion that came out at that one meeting. So grateful you showed up to supervision that day, my friend.
I always say sometimes I have a client of mine and she comes in and she was very depressed, but one day she came in and she said, God, the sunrise this morning was just so beautiful. And I said, the sunrises have been beautiful all along. For some reason, you're open to these today.
Yeah.
Right? And so in a way, there's always bad things happening around you and there's always good things happening around you. And where we choose to put our attention has a lot to do with our past history, and has a lot to do with how safe we feel. And when we feel safe, based on what you're saying, is when we have at least enough money to meet our basic needs and we have the relationships in our lives, we're able to appreciate the sunrises and the things that happen. Yeah. But really understanding that some people aren't in that place yet. Yeah. And that, you can hope and wish, and hopefully you create the experience for them that they get a chance to see the sunrise.
Awesome. Great way to wrap us up today. So I want to thank everybody for joining us again. As always, you can find show notes, discussion questions, links at traumainformedlens.org. And Jerry, always great being with you, my friend. It's fun to do this on a Friday right before checking out. I'm head home to see some family in Indiana, convinced them to get a house on the lake so we're not just sitting inside.
I'm leaving for Minnesota tomorrow to go golfing and sit on the lake too.
Excellent. So we'll both be on the lake. So, but we'll see everybody next week.
I think that's on the happiness equation. Man.
I think so too. Yeah. Well, we'll see. Bring the bug spray. We're going to the Midwest. So Jerry, have a good trip and we'll see everybody next week.
Okay, cool.